First things first, Israel has a right to exist. It's worth explicitly saying that from the outset because any criticism of Israel is, to someone out there, an implication that Israel itself and all her people should be driven into the sea. This stems from the propaganda driven into the United States that Israel is in danger of being destroyed. Some people hold to the belief that defending Israel is sticking up for the little guy. They see it as one small Jewish island in the middle of an Arab-Muslim ocean. In reality, Israel's existence is under absolutely no threat whatsoever. Israel's toughest battles were its earliest. In 1948, Israel defeated the combined armed forces of Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, plus Palestinian militias. In 1956, it defeated Egypt, and in 1967, it defeated the combined forces of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. It is only after Israel's display of military dominance in the Six-Day War in 1967 that the US started to send huge amounts of financial aid to Israel. Before that war, we only sent about $63 million per year to Israel, and only 5% of it was military aid. We don't support Israel because they're the underdog. If anything, Israel's might is one of the reasons we chose to start supporting it, because aligning ourselves with a powerful country could theoretically help us project power in the region. Not to mention, Israel is the only country in the region with a nuclear arsenal. The main conflict surrounding Israel today is over what's called the occupied territories. Israel's occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights since 1967 is considered the longest military occupation in modern history, and a violation of the Geneva Conventions. The initial seizure of these territories at the time involved the displacement of hundreds of thousands of civilians. But it's not just that the initial capture of these lands was the issue, but the ongoing occupation of these lands has led to brutal military action by Israel that goes way beyond what is morally permissible. The most appalling case of Israel's military misbehavior for me can be seen during the Second Lebanon War in 2006. The Second Israel-Lebanon War featured Israel struggling against Hezbollah. The war began when Hezbollah captured 2 Israeli soldiers and killed another 3. If you take the words of Thomas Newman, executive director of JINSA, you would think that Israel's struggles came from its hands being tied by its uncompromising moral code. Quote, "It wasn't Hezbollah that tied Israel down as much as it was Israel's own sense of morality," he said. Israel responded to the kidnappings with a massive bombing campaign against Lebanon, which in turn led Hezbollah to further retaliate with missiles and rockets at northern Israel. Within 2 days of the abduction of IDF soldiers, Israel's bombing killed more than 50 Lebanese civilians. The IDF chief of staff said he wanted to, quote, "turn back the clock of Lebanon by 20 years," and, quote, "nothing is safe." IDF deliberately targeted civilian areas like neighborhoods, supermarkets, and water treatment facilities with tens of thousands of missile strikes, leading to nearly 1 million Lebanese civilians being displaced from their homes, over 25% of the country's population. But what really stands out as a moral travesty in this story is Israel's use of cluster bombs. These bombs are extremely destructive for 2 reasons. Firstly, they are highly inaccurate because bomblets spread over a large area, and secondly, because many bomblets do not explode when first dropped, meaning that live bombs will embed themselves in the ground and rubble and function as a cross between time bombs and landmines. The use of these weapons on civilian areas is strongly frowned upon. In 1982, when the IDF was caught using them against Lebanon, President Reagan prohibited the sale of cluster bombs to Israel for 6 years. On August 11th, 3 days before the conflict would officially be ended, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1701, which called for a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. Both the Lebanese government and Hezbollah agreed to all the conditions, and the Israeli cabinet voted unanimously in favor of the resolution as well. However, before the ceasefire took effect on the 14th, Israel used the time it had to smother Lebanon in cluster bomblets. Human Rights Watch reports that Israel sprayed millions of bomblets into southern Lebanon in those final 3 days after the treaty was signed, but before it went into effect. In fact, it was estimated that 90% of all cluster munitions used in the entire war were deployed in those last 3 days. Whistleblowers from within the IDF admitted, quote, "What we did was insane and monstrous. We covered the entire towns in cluster bombs." Munitions were still being cleared from the area in 2011, 5 years after the war ended. Israel has also responded horrifically to non-violent protests. During the First Intifada, the IDF distributed clubs to its troops and encouraged them to break the bones of Palestinian protesters, who were majority non-violent. The Swedish branch of the Save the Children organization estimated that nearly 30,000 children in the occupied territories had been beaten in the first 2 years of the conflict. 1/3 of these children had broken bones, and 1/5 of these children were under the age of 6. Save the Children also concluded that out of the 106 children who died to gunshot wounds, almost all of them were, quote, hit by a directed, not random or ricochet gunfire. 20% of these children suffered multiple gunshot wounds, 15% were 10 years old or younger, 12% were shot from behind, and 20% were shot within 10 meters of their homes. And for anyone about to say that Israel has the right to defend itself, I again stress the fact that the First Intifada was a largely non-violent uprising. In the first year of the protests in Gaza, 0 Israelis had been killed, but 142 Palestinians had been. Of course, as of early 2025, the most recent wave of conflict is still ongoing that began on October 7, 2023, when Hamas attacked Israel. Since then, the response by Israel has been unrelenting. Israel likes to say it has the most moral military in the world and that they are strictly at war with Hamas. But the reality is that the majority of the Gaza Strip and the people in it have been under assault. 69% of the buildings in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed, including 50% of hospitals, 68% of farmland, 88% of schools, and 83% of mosques. Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, home to 2.4 million people. 50,000 people have been killed in Gaza since October 7th. Most of these deaths have been civilians, with the highest estimates putting 70% of the deaths being women and children. This is the definition of indiscriminate. Is Israel targeting civilians in Gaza? I don't know. But they are certainly not taking any precaution to spare them. But what about Hamas? Isn't this Hamas's fault for the brutality they subjected the Israelis to on that day? Well, if we're going to make a moral argument here, whatever moral high ground Israel may have had over Hamas has been forfeited. The IDF treats Palestinians every bit as badly as Hamas treats Israelis. In July of 2024, chaotic protests broke out in Israel after footage surfaced of IDF members sodomizing Palestinian prisoners of war with a broomstick. The protests escalated to the point where an army base was actually broken into. You may be thinking, that makes sense, sexually torturing prisoners is unacceptable. But actually, the protests were not at the actions of the IDF members who tortured the prisoners, but instead, the protests were in response to these soldiers being arrested. Hanok Mildwitsky, a member of Israel's legislative branch of government, was asked whether it was legitimate, quote, to insert a stick into a person's rectum. His response was,
להכניס מקל לרקטום של בן אדם, זה לגיטימי?
כן, אם הוא נוח'בה, הכל לגיטימי לעשות לו.
אוקיי,
הכל.
מצוין.
הכל.